Hospitals are places where stories of life and death unfold, but they are also the custodians of strange secrets, mysteries that only those who work the night shifts can truly appreciate. These secrets are not always easy to explain. Sometimes they defy logic and reason, but they are felt deeply by those who experience them. Nurses and doctors in the stillness of the night whisper tales of things they've seen, heard, or felt in the quiet corners of these hallowed walls. It's during these overnight shifts, when the rest of the world is asleep, that the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural often blur. The atmosphere of a hospital at night is unlike any other. The corridors are empty. The only sound the monotonous hum of machines, occasionally punctuated by the soft shuffle of slippers or the sighs of exhausted staff. The air seems to carry a weight, as if the walls themselves are holding on to the countless stories they've witnessed over the years. A sense of calm, mixed with an undercurrent of unease, settles in. And it's in this eerie silence that the strange stories of hospitals take root, stories that continue to haunt those who work long into the night. One such night, Dr. Williams was on duty, working the night shift on a nearly empty medical floor. This floor, typically reserved for patients in critical condition, had only a handful of patients that night, each of them hanging on to life by a thread. Among them was Mr. Peterson, an elderly man in his late 80s who had been in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. His body was stable, but there was little hope. The doctors had all but given up on him, and his family had already said their goodbyes. He had been unresponsive for so long that everyone had prepared for the inevitable. The end seemed imminent. Yet that night, as Dr. Williams made his rounds, a sense of unease lingered in the air. The hospital, as usual, was quiet, eerily quiet. But there was something different about the atmosphere tonight. As he walked down the long hallway toward Mr. Peterson's room, he noticed a faint sound. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whispering coming from somewhere down the hall. At first, he thought it was just the usual mechanical noise, the beeping and buzzing of hospital machines. But as he listened more intently, he realized that it was something else entirely. The whispering wasn't coming from any machine. It was as if someone was speaking very softly, almost to themselves, in the distance. Dr. Williams felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't just the chill of the cold hospital air. It was the sensation of something strange, something unexplainable, lingering just outside of his understanding. His instincts told him to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand. But something in the back of his mind kept tugging at him, urging him to investigate further. He shook off the unease and continued down the hallway toward Mr. Peterson's room. As he approached the door, the whispering faded, but a heavy silence hung in the air. He paused for a moment, glancing into the room through the small window in the door. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the room, and for a moment he saw nothing unusual. But as he pushed open the door and stepped inside, he froze. There, in the bed, lay Mr. Peterson, awake. The old man's eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. It wasn't just the fact that he was awake after being in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. It was the eerie calmness in his gaze, as if he was looking beyond the room, beyond the walls, into something that no one else could see. "Mr. Peterson," Dr. Williams asked, his voice shaking slightly. He had seen many things in his years of practice, but this was different. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The elderly man slowly turned his head, his eyes locking with the doctor's. For a moment there was a blankness, as though he didn't recognize the doctor. But then, as if something clicked in his mind, Mr. Peterson's face softened and he whispered, "She's waiting. She's leaving us tonight." The doctor's heart skipped a beat. He looked around the room, half expecting to see someone else there, but the room was empty. "Who's waiting, Mr. Peterson?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Peterson's gaze shifted, his eyes focusing on something just over Dr. Williams's shoulder. His expression was serene, almost peaceful, as though he was seeing something the doctor couldn't. "She's here, waiting for me," he said, his voice growing fainter, as if speaking to someone beyond the room. Dr. Williams felt a sudden chill creep over him. It wasn't just the temperature of the room. It was the feeling that something was present, something unseen, yet very real. He resisted the urge to look over his shoulder, but a shiver ran through him. The atmosphere in the room had changed, shifted into something unfamiliar and unsettling. It was as though Mr. Peterson's words, though whispered so faintly, had unlocked something in the air, a presence that couldn't be explained. The doctor stayed for a few moments longer, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But no answers came. The whispering, the eerie calmness in Mr. Peterson's eyes, and his cryptic words. Everything about this night felt out of place. As he left the room, Dr. Williams couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just occurred, something he would never be able to explain. He looked back at Mr. Peterson one last time, and for the briefest of moments he thought he saw the old man smile, as if knowing something that no one else could ever understand. That night, as Dr. Williams made his way back to the nurse's station, the whispering returned. But this time it wasn't from down the hall. It was right behind him, faint but unmistakable. "She's waiting." The hospital, with all its stories of life and death, had just added another strange chapter to its long, mysterious history. And as the night shift dragged on, Dr. Williams couldn't help but wonder. Who was waiting? And what had Mr. Peterson seen in those final moments that the rest of them had missed? From the machines. It was too deliberate, too soft, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. It sent a chill up his spine. Dr. Williams paused in his tracks, straining his ears to catch any coherent words. He stood there for a moment, in the quiet of the corridor, trying to dismiss the sensation creeping over him. The hospital had been known for its strange occurrences, lights flickering on their own, doors creaking open without explanation, patients murmuring in their sleep about things no one else could see. But this felt different. It wasn't just an odd sound. It felt like something was out of place. Something was watching. He shook off the feeling, deciding it was just fatigue, and proceeded to Mr. Peterson's room. As he approached the door, the whispering seemed to grow fainter, as though retreating into the shadows. His mind raced through various rational explanations. A malfunctioning speaker system, a nearby patient murmuring in their sleep. But nothing seemed to add up. He opened the door to Mr. Peterson's room with his usual quiet care. The room was dimly lit, the soft beeping of machines providing the only company. Mr. Peterson's frail form lay motionless in the bed, his body covered in sheets, his eyes closed. It was the same scene he had witnessed day after day, but something was different. Dr. Williams felt a strange unease as he stepped closer to the bed. As his gaze landed on Mr. Peterson's face, his heart skipped a beat. The elderly man, who had been in a deep coma for nearly 2 weeks, was staring up at the ceiling, wide-eyed and awake. "Mr. Peterson?" Dr. Williams whispered, his voice shaking slightly. He leaned closer, unsure of what to make of the situation. The man's eyes flickered in his direction but did not focus entirely on him. Instead, Mr. Peterson's gaze seemed fixed on something beyond the doctor, as though he was seeing something that wasn't there. The doctor hesitated, his heart racing. He reached out and placed a hand on Mr. Peterson's arm, feeling the warmth of life coursing through his skin. "Mr. Peterson, can you hear me?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. To his shock, the old man's lips parted, and in a raspy, fragile voice he murmured, "She's leaving us tonight." Dr. Williams froze, unsure whether he had heard correctly. "Who is leaving, Mr. Peterson?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but his mind was spinning. Mr. Peterson's gaze shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as though focusing on something just behind the doctor. He spoke again, this time with more clarity, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's waiting. For me." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning but completely unfathomable. Dr. Williams felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the room was empty. The silence was suffocating. "Who are you talking about, Mr. Peterson?" Dr. Williams pressed, his curiosity and concern growing. Was this some kind of delirium, or was Mr. Peterson seeing something beyond the physical world? But the elderly man simply smiled, a serene, peaceful smile, as though he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. His eyes, though clouded with age, now seemed filled with understanding, as though he had been given a glimpse into a world beyond the one they occupied. "She's here. She's been waiting for me," Mr. Peterson whispered again, almost lovingly, his voice fading. Dr. Williams watched in silence, a sense of dread creeping over him. The room, which had once seemed so sterile and empty, now felt charged with an energy that he couldn't explain. The whispering he had heard outside the door suddenly made sense. Was it the voice of this mysterious woman Mr. Peterson had been speaking of? Who was she? Why was Mr. Peterson so calm, so ready to let go? Just as Dr. Williams was about to speak again, Mr. Peterson's breathing grew shallow, and his eyes closed once more, as though he had been given a final moment of peace. The faint whispering that had filled the room earlier died away, leaving only the soft beeping of the heart monitor and the silence that enveloped the room. The doctor stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Had Mr. Peterson truly seen something? Had he been in touch with something beyond this world, or was it simply a product of his delirium, brought on by the days of unconsciousness? He couldn't be sure. As he left the room, his mind was still spinning, trying to find logical explanations for what had just occurred. But deep down he knew that sometimes some things could never be explained. Hospitals, after all, were places where life and death intersect, where the line between the known and the unknown often blurred, leaving behind stories that defy explanation. And as Dr. Williams walked back down the corridor, the whispering seemed to follow him, soft, distant, and unsettling, as though the hospital itself held on to its secrets, waiting for the next person brave enough to hear them. Dr. Williams felt a strong shock. Mr. Peterson, whom he had mentally prepared for the almost certain death, was now waking up. His eyes were wide open, but they did not look like those of a conscious person. His gaze was absent, as if he were looking at something only he could see. The feeling was indescribable, like Mr. Peterson was trying to communicate with some world, a world that only he could perceive. "Mr. Peterson," Dr. Williams asked, his voice slightly anxious. He leaned over, trying to get Mr. Peterson's attention, but he only stared at the ceiling, his eyes following something out of reach. With a sense of unease, Dr. Williams gently placed his hand on Mr. Peterson's arm, feeling the warmth from his body. Despite being in a coma for a long time, his body still showed signs of life. In that moment, Dr. Williams felt as if something sacred was present in the room. He asked again, more softly, "Mr. Peterson, is something wrong?" At that moment, Mr. Peterson slowly opened his mouth, and in a hoarse, weak voice he whispered, "She will come. She is waiting." Dr. Williams could not understand these words. "Who is she, Mr. Peterson? Who is she waiting for?" He could not hold back the curiosity and growing fear inside him. Mr. Peterson gently turned his head, his gaze fixing on a point behind the doctor. It was not the gaze of a patient. It was a serene look, as if he were seeing something that no one else could. The whole room fell silent, and Dr. Williams sensed a strange shift in the atmosphere. It seemed as though there was an invisible presence in the room. Dr. Williams felt his entire body stiffen, as if an electric current were running through him. Mr. Peterson wasn't just staring into space. He seemed to be looking at something very specific, something the doctor couldn't see. The feeling grew more intense by the second. Dr. Williams felt a wave of coldness sweep through the room, and though nothing physically had changed, the atmosphere felt heavy, as if an invisible figure were standing nearby. "She's waiting for me," Mr. Peterson repeated in a hoarse voice. "She won't leave me alone anymore." Dr. Williams's heart began to race. Mr. Peterson's words echoed like a prophecy. It seemed as if he was speaking about an event that was about to happen, something beyond human comprehension. The doctor couldn't tear his gaze away from Mr. Peterson's face, and the strange feeling grew stronger. Dr. Williams wanted to ask more, but he couldn't bring himself to. A sense of fear was rising inside him, and he couldn't make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, Mr. Peterson lifted his head and looked directly at the doctor. His eyes seemed different now. They were bright, full of awareness. But they weren't the eyes of a patient awaiting death. They looked as though they were seeing something from beyond this world. "Doctor, she is waiting here." Mr. Peterson sighed, and in that moment the room seemed to darken. The faint light from the wall lamp seemed to grow dimmer. Dr. Williams felt an indescribable strangeness. He turned around to look around the room, but there was nothing to be seen but cold walls and the sound of machines still humming. However, that feeling, the feeling of an unseen presence, remained.